Good morning. Page 265. The following day, January 27th, was a Sunday. They didn't drive us out to work to make up for lost time, although the bosses, of course, were itching to get back on schedule, but simply fed us, issued arrears of rations, and let us wander about the camp. We all went from hut to hut, telling each other how we had felt in the past few days, and we were all in a holiday mood, as though we had won instead of losing. Besides, our kind masters promised yet again that all legitimate requests, but who knew who was to define what was legitimate, would be satisfied. There was, however, one untoward little event. A certain Volodka Ponomarev, a bitch who had been with us throughout the strike, heard many rash speeches and looked into many eyes, ran away to the guardhouse, which meant that he had run to betray us outside the camp area, where he could avoid the knife. For me, the whole essence of the criminal world crystallized in Ponomarev's flight. Their alleged nobility is just a matter of caste obligations, but when they find themselves in the whirlpool of revolution, they inevitably behave treacherously. They can understand no principles, only brute force. It was an easy guess that our bosses were getting ready to arrest the ringleaders, but they announced that, on the contrary, commissions of inquiry had arrived from Karaganda, Alma-Ata, and Moscow to look into things. A table was placed on the ground, stiff with hoarfrost, in the middle of the camp, where we lined up for work assignment, and some high-ranking officers sat at it in sheepskin coats and felt boots, and invited us to come forward with our complaints. Many prisoners went and talked to them. Notes were taken. After work on Tuesday, they assembled the foreman to present complaints. In reality, this conference was another low trick, a form of interrogation. They knew that the prisoners were boiling with resentment and let them vent it so they could be sure in arresting the right people. This was my last day as foreman. My neglected tumor was growing rapidly, and for a long time now I had been putting off my operation until, in camp terms, it was convenient. In January, and particularly during the fatal days of the hunger strike, the tumor decided for me that it was now convenient, and seemed to get bigger by the hour. The moment the huts were opened, I showed myself to the doctors, and they set a date for the operation. I dragged myself to this last conference. It was convened in the spacious anteroom to the bathhouse. They placed the presidium's table in front of the barbers' chairs, and seated at it were one MPD colonel, several lieutenant colonels, and some smaller fry, with our camp commanders inconspicuous in the second row behind them. There too, behind the backs of the presidium, sat the note-takers, making hasty notes throughout the meeting, while the front row helped them by repeating the names of speakers. One man stood out from the rest, a certain lieutenant colonel from the special section, or from the organs, a quick, clever, nimble-witted villain, with a tall brow and a long face. This quick-wittedness, these narrow features, somehow made it difficult to believe that he belonged to that pack of obtuse political officers. The foremen were reluctant to come forward, and practically had to be dragged to their feet from the close-packed benches. As soon as I started saying something of their own, they were interrupted and invited to explain why people were being murdered and what were the aims of the strikers. And if a hapless foreman tried to give some sort of answer to the questions, reason for murders, nature of demands, the whole pack at once flung itself upon him. And how do you know that? You're connected with these gangsters? Right, let's have their names. This was their idea of fair and honorable inquiry into the legitimacy of our demands. The lofty-browed villain of a lieutenant colonel was especially quick to interrupt speakers. He had a nimble tongue and the advantage of impunity. With his caustic interjections, he thwarted each of our attempts to present our case. From the tone which the proceedings were beginning to take, you would have thought we only faced any charges and needed to defend ourselves. That only we faced any charges. An urge to put a stop to this swelled inside me. I took the floor and gave my name, which was repeated for the note-taker. I rose from the bench, pretty certain that there was no one in the gathering who could trot out a rounded sentence more easily than I. The only difficulty was that I had no idea what to tell them. All that is written in these pages, all that we had gone through, and all that we had brooded over in all those years and all those days on hunger strike, I might as well try telling it to orangutans as to them. They were still, in some formal sense, Russians, still more or less capable of understanding fairly simple Russian phrases, such as permission to enter, permission to speak, sir. But as they sat there, all in a row at the long table, exhibiting their sleek white complacent, uniformly blank physiognomies, it was plain that they had long ago degenerated into a distinct biological type, that verbal communication between us had broken down beyond repair, and that we could exchange only bullets. Only the long-headed one had not yet turned into an orangutan. His hearing and understanding were excellent. The moment I spoke, he tried to interrupt me. With the whole audience paying close attention, a duel of lightning-swift repartee began. Where do you work? What difference could that make, I wonder? In the engineering shops, I rapped out over my shoulder and hurried on with more important things. He came straight back at me. Where they make the knives? No, I said, parrying his thrust. Where they repair self-propelled excavators. I don't know myself how my mind worked so quickly and clearly. Hurry, make them be quiet and listen, that's the main thing. The brute crouched behind the table and suddenly pounced to sink his fangs in me. You are here because the bandits delegated you? No, because you invited me. I snapped back triumphantly and went on talking and talking. He sprang at me once or twice more, was beaten off, and I sat completely silent. I had won, but to what purpose? Just one more year to go, and the thought crushed me. I could not get out the words they deserved to hear. I could have delivered there and then an immortal speech and been shot the next day. I would have delivered it just the same if they had been broadcasting it throughout the world, but no, the audience was too small. So I did not tell them that our camps followed the fascist model and were a symptom of the regime's degeneration. I limited myself to waving a kerosene-soaked rag under their eagerly sniffing noses. I had learned that the commander of convoy troops was sitting there, and so I deplored the unworthy conduct of the camp guards, who had ceased to resemble Soviet fighting men, who joined in pilfering from work sites and they were bores and bullies, and they were murderers into the bargain. Then I portrayed the warders in camps as a gang of greedy rogues who forced Zex to steal building materials for them. This was quite true, except that it started with the officers sitting and listening to me. And what a counter-educational effect all this had, I said, on prisoners desirous of amendment. I didn't like my speech myself. The only good thing about it was that we were now setting the pace. In the interval of silence which I had won, one of the foremen, T, rose and spoke slowly, almost inarticulately, whether because that was natural to him or because he was extremely agitated. I used to agree when other prisoners said, "We live like dogs." The brute in the presidium bristled. T kneaded a cap in his hands, an ugly cropped-headed convict, his coarsened features contorted by his struggle to find the right words. But now I see that I was wrong. The brute's face cleared. "We live much worse than dogs," T rapped out with a sudden emphasis, and all the foremen sat bolt upright. "A dog has only one number on his collar. We have 4. Dogs are fed on meat. We are fed on fish bones. A dog doesn't get put in a cooler. A dog doesn't get shot from watchtowers. Dogs don't get 25ers pinned on them." They could interrupt whenever they liked now. He had said all that mattered. Chernogorov rose, introducing himself as a hero of the Soviet Union, then another foreman, and both of them spoke boldly and passionately. Their names were echoed in the presidium with heavy significance. "Maybe this can only lead to our destruction, lads. And maybe it is only by banging our heads against it that we can bring this accursed wall down." The meeting ended in a draw. All was quiet for a few days. The commission was seen no more, and life was so peaceful in our camp division that there might never have been any trouble. An escort took me off to a hospital on the Ukrainian side. I was the first to be taken there since the hunger strike, the first to swallow. Yanchenko, the surgeon who was to operate on me, had called me in for examination, but his questions and my answers were not about my tumor. He was not interested in my tumor, and I was glad to have such a reliable doctor. There was no end to his question. His face was dark with the pain we all shared. The same experience in different lives can be seen in very different perspectives. This tumor, which was to all appearances malignant, what a blow it would have been if I were a free man. How I should have suffered, how my loved ones would have wept. But in this place, where heads were so casually severed from trunks, the same tumor was just an excuse to stay in bed. I didn't give it much thought. I was lying in the hospital among those wounded and maimed on that bloody night. There were men beaten by the warders to a bloody pulp. They had nothing left to lie on. Their flesh was in ribbons. One burly warder had been particularly brutal with his length of iron piping. Memory, I cannot now recall his name. One man had already died from his wounds. News came in thick and fast. The punitive operations had begun in the Russian camp division. 40 men had been arrested. For fear of a fresh mutiny, they did it this way. Until the very last day, the bosses showed nothing but kindness, and you could only suppose that they were trying to decide which of their own numbers were to blame. But on the appointed day, as the work teams were passing through the gates, they noticed that the escort party which took charge of them was 2 or 3 times its normal strength. The plan was to seize the victims where prisoners could not help one another, nor could the walls of huts or buildings under construction help them. The escort marched the columns out of the camp and took them by different ways to the steppe. But before they had brought any of them to their destination, the officers in command gave their orders. Halt! Weapons at the ready. Chamber cartridges. Prisoners, sit down. I shall count to 3 and fire if you aren't sitting down. Everyone sit. Once again, as at Epiphany the year before, tricked and helpless, the slaves were pinned to the snow. Then, too, an officer had unfolded a piece of paper and read out the names and numbers of those who had to rise, leave the unresisting herd, and pass through the cordon. Next, this handful of mutineers was marched back under a separate escort, or else a Black Maria rolled up to collect them. The herd, now purged of fermenting agents, was then brought to its feet and driven to work. Our educators had shown us whether we could ever believe anything they said. They also plucked out candidates for jail in the campgrounds while they were deserted for the day, and the rest easily flitted over that 4-meter wall which the strike had been unable to surmount, and pecked at the Ukrainian camp division. The very day before my operation was due, Yanchenko, the surgeon, was arrested and taken off to jail. Prisoners continued to be arrested or posted to other camps. It was always difficult to know which, without the precautions observed at the beginning. Small groups of 20 or 30 were sent off somewhere. Suddenly, on February 19th, they began assembling an enormous transport, some 700 strong. They were under special discipline. As they left the camp, they were handcuffed. Fate had exacted retribution. The Ukrainians, who had taken such good care not to help the Muscovites, were thicker on the ground in this transport than we were. True, on the point of leaving, they saluted our shattered strike, a new wood processing plant, itself oddly enough built entirely of wood, in Kazakhstan, where there is no timber and lots of stone, for reasons which remain officially unexplained, but I know for certain that there was arson, burst into flames at several points simultaneously, and within 2 hours 3 million rubles had gone up in smoke. For those on their way to be shot, it was like a Viking's funeral, the old Scandinavian custom of burning the hero's boat together with his body. I was lying in the recovery room. I was alone in the ward. The camp was in such a turmoil that no one could be admitted. The hospital had come to a standstill. After my room, which was at the butt end of the hut, came the morgue, where Dr. Kornfeld's body had been lying for I don't know how many days because no one had time to bury him. Morning and evening, a warder, nearing the end of his round, would stop outside and, to simplify the count, embrace my room and the morgue in one inclusive gesture. 2 more here, and ticked us off on his clipboard. Pavel Broniak, who had also been called to join the large transport, broke through all the cordons and came to embrace me before he left. Not just our camp, but the whole of creation seemed to be shaken, reeling before the storm. We were storm-tossed, and we could not realize that outside the camp all was calm and stagnant as ever. We felt as though we were riding great waves on something that might sink under our feet, and that if we ever saw each other again, it would be in quite a different country. But just in case, farewell, my friend. Farewell, all my friends. That year of tedium and stupidity, my last year in Ekapat suits, and the last Stalinist year on the archipelago, dragged on. After they had been kept in jail for a while and no evidence against them found, a few, but only a few, were sent back into the camp, while many, very many, whom we had come to know and love over the years were taken away, some for further investigation and trial, others to the isolator, because of some indelible black mark on their dossiers, although they might long since have been more like angels than prisoners. Others again to the Jeshkasgan mines, and there was even a transport of the mentally defective. Kishkin, the Joker, was squeezed in with this lot, and the doctors also fixed up Volodya Gershuni. To replace those who had left, the stoolies crawled one by one out of this safe deposit, timidly and apprehensively at first, then more and more brazenly. One who returned to the body of the camp was the venal bitch, Volodka Ponomarev, once a mere lathe operator, but now in charge of the parcels room. The distribution of the precious crumbs collected by destitute families was a task which the old Czechist Maximenko naturally entrusted to a notorious thief. The security officers again started summoning anyone and everyone to their offices as often as they pleased. It was an airless spring. Anyone whose horns or ears stuck out too much quickly learned to keep his head down. I did not go back to my foreman's job. There were now plenty of foremen again, but became a smelter's mate, in a foundry. We had to work hard that year. For reasons which I shall explain. The one and only concession which the administration made when all our hopes and demands lay in ruins was to make us self-financing. Under this system, what we produced did not simply vanish into the maw of Gulag, but was priced at 45% of its value, and 45% of its value was counted as our earnings. The rest went to the state. Of these earnings, the camp appropriated 70% for the maintenance of guards, dogs, barbed wire, the camp jails, security officers, the officers responsible for discipline, for censorship, for education, in a word, all the things without which our lives would be unlivable. But the remaining 30%, 13.5% of the whole product, was credited to the personal account of the prisoner, and part of this money, though not all of it, provided you had not misbehaved, not been late, not been rude, not been a disappointment to your bosses, you could, on application, once a month convert into new camp currency vouchers. These vouchers you could spend. The system was so contrived that the more sweat you lost, the more blood you gave, the closer you came to that 30%. But if you didn't feel like breaking your back, all your labor went to the camp, and you got zero. And the majority, what part the majority plays in our history, especially when it is carefully prepared by weeding, gratefully gulped down this sop from its bosses and risked working itself to death to buy condensed milk, margarine, and nasty sweets at the food counter, or get itself a second supper in the commercial dining room. And since worksheets were made up for the team as a whole, not for individual members, all those who didn't want to sacrifice their health for margarine still had to do it so that their comrades could earn more. They also started bringing films to the camp much more frequently than before. As is always the case in camps, or in villages, or in remote workers' settlements, no one had enough respect for the spectators to announce the titles in advance. A pig, after all, is not informed in advance what is going to be poured into its trough. Nonetheless, the prisoners, could they be the same prisoners who had kept up the hunger strike so heroically that winter, now flocked in, grabbed seats an hour before the windows were draped, without worrying one little bit whether the film was worth it. Bread and circuses, such a cliche that it's embarrassing to repeat it. No one could blame people for wanting to eat their fill after so many years of hunger, but while we were there filling our bellies, comrades of ours, some who had taught us to fight, some who had shouted no surrender to their hut mates in those January days, and some who had not been involved at all, were at that moment on trial somewhere. Comrades of ours were being shot or carried off to begin new sentences in isolation camps, or broken by interrogation after interrogation, bundled into cells where condemned men had scratched a forest of crosses on the walls, and the snake of a major looked in to smile a promise. Ah, Panine, I remember you. Oh yes, I remember you. The wheels are turning. Don't worry, we'll soon process you. A fine word, that. Process. You can process a man for the next world, process a man into the cooler for 24 hours, and a chit for a pair of second-hand trousers may also be processed. But the door is slammed shut. The snake has gone, smiling enigmatically, leaving you to guess, to spend a month without sleep, to beat your head against the stones, wondering how exactly they intend to process you. Talking about it is easy, though. Suddenly in Ecbatsus, they got together another party of 20 men for transportation. Rather a strange party. They were gathered unhurriedly. They were not treated harshly. They were not isolated. It was almost as though they were being assembled for release. Not one of them, however, was anywhere near the end of his sentence, nor were any of those hard-boiled sects among them whom the bosses tried to break with their spells in the cooler and special punishments. No, they were all good prisoners, in good standing with their superiors. There, once again, was the slippery and self-assured foreman of the vehicle repair shop, Mikhail Mikhailovich Janhalov, the crafty simpleton, Belousov, a foreman machinist, the engineer and technician, Gultayev, the Moscow designer Leonid Rykov, a grave and steady man with the face of a statesman, the very amiable, universally friendly Zhenka Milyukov, a lathe operator with a pert pancake face, and another lathe operator, the Georgian Kochareva, a great lover of truth, hot in defense of justice when the crowd was looking. Where are they going? From the party's composition, obviously not to maximum punishment prison. Must be a nice place you're going to, they were told. They'll be taking the guards off you. But not one of them showed a glimmer of happiness. Not for a single moment. They wagged their heads miserably, reluctantly gathered their belongings, in two minds as to whether to take them or to leave them. They looked like beaten curs. Could they really have grown so fond of turbulent Ecbatsus? They even said goodbye with lips that seemed numb and unconvincing intonation. They were taken away. Were we not given time to forget them? 3 weeks later, the word went around. They'd been brought back here. Yes, all of them, yes. Only they're sitting in the staff barracks and won't go to their own huts. This put the finishing touch to the strike of 3,000 at Ecbatsus, the strike of the traitors. So much for their reluctance to go. In the interrogator's offices, when they were snitching on our friends and signing their perfidious statements, they had hoped that it would all be kept under seal in the confessional. It had, of course, been that way for decades. A political denunciation was regarded as an unchallengeable document, and the informant's identity was never released. But something about our strike, and need perhaps to vindicate themselves in the eyes of their superiors, had compelled our bosses to mount a full-dress trial somewhere in Karaganda. These creatures were taken off one day, and when they looked into each other's anxious eyes, each of them realized that he and all the others were on their way to testify in court. That wouldn't have bothered them, but they knew Gulag's post-war rule. A prisoner called away for some temporary purpose must be returned to his former camp, They were, however, promised that, by way of exception, they would be left in Karaganda. An order was in fact drafted, but incorrectly, not in due form, and Karaganda refused to have them. They were 3 weeks on the road. Their guards herded them from Stolopin cars into transit camps, and from transit camps into Stolopin cars, yelled at them to sit on the ground, searched them, took away their belongings, rushed them into the bathhouse, fed them on herrings and gave them no water. They received the full treatment used to wear down ordinary uncooperative prisoners. Then they were taken under guard to the courtroom, where they faced yet again those whom they had denounced, this time to drive the final nails into their coffins, hang the locks on the doors of their solitary cells, wind back their sentences so that they would have long years to run, after which they were brought home by all those transit prisons and flung without their masks into their old camp. They were no longer needed. Informers are like ferrymen. But was not the camp now pacified? Had not nearly 1,000 men been moved out? Could anybody now prevent them from going along to the Godfather's office? Nevertheless, they wouldn't leave the staff building. They were on strike. They refused to enter the campgrounds. Only Ch11 made up his mind to brazen it out in his old role of lover of truth. He went to his team and said, "We don't know why they took us. They took us all over the place and then brought us back." But his daring just lasted one night and one dawn. The next day he fled to the staff room and his friends, so that what had happened had not gone for nothing, and our comrades had not fallen in vain. The atmosphere in the camp would never be as oppressive as before. Meanness was back on its throne, but very precariously. Politics were freely discussed in the huts. No work assigner or foreman would dare kick a Zek and take a swing at it, because everybody knew now how easy it is to make knives, and how easily they sink home between the ribs. Our little island had experienced an earthquake and ceased to belong to the archipelago. This was how Ikabatsus felt. It is doubtful whether Karaganda felt the same, and certain that Moscow did not. The special camp system was beginning to collapse in one place after another, but our father and teacher had no inkling of it. It was not, of course, reported to him, and in any case, incapable as he was of giving up anything, he would only have relinquished Katorga on the day his chair burst into flames beneath him. On the contrary, he planned a new great wave of arrests for 1953, perhaps in connection with the new war, and in 1952 expanded the special camp network accordingly. Thus it was decreed that the Ikabatsus camp should be converted from a division of steppe leg, or at times Peshant leg, into the headquarters of a new big special camp complex in the Irtysh Basin, provisionally called Daleg, so that over and above the numerous slave drivers already there, a whole new administration of parasites arrived in Ikabatsus, and these as well we had to support by our labor. New prisoners, too, were expected any day. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.